bleeding out of your eyeballs, internal organs turning to mush, Ebola. It's not a pretty way to go. And the threat to America and the world is very real. We'll talk to experts on bioterror today on The Hot Zone.
This is The Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey everyone, it just struck me that there was a great novel I read years ago about an Ebola outbreak in the United States. It's the kind of fiction that keeps you up late at night and makes you shudder to think about the possibility of, a pandemic of an incurable virus like Ebola. Ugh. That novel, as it happens, was called The Hot Zone. So, in some parts of Africa today, that fiction's now a reality. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, there have been more than 600 cases reported of the Ebola virus, and the mortality rate is over 50%. A nightmare scenario in a country with poor infrastructure and more than 85 million people. Now, I visited the DRC like 10 years ago, and let me show you what it looks like, just to give you an idea of the scope of the problem. This is Goma, Democratic Republic of Congo. The people of this war-torn country are celebrating. After a generation of war, there may finally be light at the end of the tunnel. There were dark days in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide more than a decade ago. Hutu criminals fled into Congo and continued their reign of terror on local villagers. These women are some of their victims, all of them gang raped by Hutu militiamen. Tutsi militias sprang up to protect their people, and both sides clashed with government forces along the border. But the violence wasn't just over ethnicity. All sides have a stake in Congo's vast mineral wealth as well. The result? Infrastructure is almost non-existent. Survival is the best most people can hope for. In the warfare of the last decade, non-combatants have paid the highest price, with death and destruction in Holocaust proportions. Over 5 million killed and another million made homeless. But allegiances here can change quickly. Recently, two bitter enemies, the Congolese and Rwandan army, joined forces to hunt down the leader of the Tutsi resistance, Laurent Nkunda. They captured him as he fled with a truckload of blood money into Rwanda. Then last week, the Hutu militias agreed to lay down their arms and leave Congo altogether. As I drove around the city of Goma, the mood was cautiously jubilant. People marched in the streets to celebrate the ceasefire. At the Beth Saida Pentecostal Church, Sunday services were filled with joyful songs of praise. The pastor, Kabutu Birgiagi, explains.
We pray again, but now we don't pray. We praise the Lord. God, thank you. God, thank you. Yeah, that is our prayer now.
For the hundreds of thousands of people who are still living in these camps for internally displaced people around Kivu province, it seems like they're short of just about everything except children. Even if the peace holds, it will take years for this country to get back on its feet. And that fact is keeping these believers on their knees in prayer.
The future, we have to work much to have our peace full.
Chuck Holton, CBN News, in Goma, Eastern Congo. Well, all the optimism that was shown 10 years ago when I filmed that piece has kind of evaporated. There have been sporadic outbreaks of violence and fighting in that area ever since. Presidential elections were held in the DRC on December 30th to elect a replacement for the President Joseph Kabila, who had held the office since 2001. Now, there hasn't been an orderly transfer of power in Congo since 1960, and it looks like this one isn't going to be much different. All this instability and violence is causing people to flee from the DRC in record numbers and into neighboring countries. Add that to the second largest outbreak of the Ebola virus in history, and you've got the potential makings of a pandemic that could kill millions of people. A new U.S. Embassy security alert is telling U.S. citizens in that country to get out now. Leave with all haste. It says to expect violence to break out once the results of the election get announced because there have been so many irregularities in this election process. Basically, nobody trusts the outcome, no matter who is declared the winner. Well, the other day I would just so happen to meet one of the foremost experts on Ebola on the planet, a microbiologist who has been instrumental in developing a vaccine for Ebola, which has been used on more than 60,000 people already in the Congo last year in an attempt to stop the transmission of the virus.
I'm Ellen Jo Barron, PhD, diplomat of the American College of Microbiology, Professor Emerita of Pathology and Microbiology, Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. And I have been working with Ebola in my second job as Executive Director of Medical Affairs for Cepheid, the world's second largest molecular diagnostics company. Ebola is a virus that once it gains entry into your tissues and into your bloodstream, it will multiply very quickly and it will break down all the linings of your capillaries and allow blood to seep into all your tissues and all the liquids that you discharge. So since the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, becomes leaky, blood will go into the GI tract, and when you defecate, it will be full of blood. Your eyes will begin to bleed, your nose will bleed, your saliva will be tinged with blood because your capillaries are no longer able to maintain the blood within the tubes. And so eventually the virus breaks down the entire tissue of your body and you die. You catch it by coming into contact with secretions from an infected patient. And it can't penetrate intact skin. So it has to penetrate either through your eyes, your nose, your mouth, or through a cut. The mortality of an infection is anywhere from 50% to 80 or 90%, depending on the supportive care you get. Although there are some treatments in clinical trials in the Congo, where the ongoing outbreak is, there is no known cure for Ebola virus infection. You can't catch it by casual contact, but there is a potential for airborne transmission. So actually, if someone sneezed on the bus and you breathed in that sneeze particles fairly quickly, you could contract Ebola from that.
So what's the biggest fear that the CDC has about Ebola?
I think the biggest fear is the panic that would be engendered in the population if there were some Ebola cases detected in the United States. When patients come back from the Ebola zone, they're placed in the strictest type of quarantine possible just to prevent additional cases from occurring. But only healthcare workers or people who come in direct contact with those patients would be at risk. It's very hard to weaponize Ebola to infect a lot of people at one time easily, because the virus will live in blood for up to 3 weeks, for example. So if you had large quantities of infected blood and you blew those tubes of blood up in a crowd, everybody who got hit by a piece of glass would become infected by Ebola, but that would be several hundred people at most. You can't put it into the air and disseminate it into a stadium like you could anthrax spores. If you contrast Bacillus anthracis and Ebola virus as pathogens for bioterrorism purposes, anthrax is a much more reasonable risk because you can weaponize the spores. They will live in the environment for years, dried. You can grow it in culture easily, so you could grow billions and billions of them, put them in some sort of bomb, wait until the right moment, and then disperse them widely. Whereas Ebola, the most time it will live is 3 or 4 weeks, and it must be in protein or in blood. You can't dry it out and then disseminate it. So you would have a much smaller group of people that you could infect at one time. So anthrax is a bacterium that grows very quickly. It makes an environmentally strong, resistant spore form that can exist in the soil or on a dry surface for years, waiting for the proper environment to then regerminate and become a bacillus. And anthrax is weaponizable because of those spores. We've already seen in 2001 a huge national panic attack when only 3 or 4 people actually became infected with anthrax when it was sent through the mail in spores. But everyone else thought they were at risk, and other people became very excited. It was easily cured, and you can disinfect a building using hydrogen peroxide vapor, for example, easily. But nevertheless, large numbers of people could be infected by weaponized spores. Whereas Ebola, you could infect 100 people at once, but not much more than that. And then each individual additional case would be a person-to-person contact. When in Africa, there are a number of cultural norms, such as how to manage a dead body and bury the body. And so family members want hands-on the body. They want to be able to bathe the body, clothe the body. It's hard to get those people to change that behavior until the test has been performed to rule out Ebola. So the biggest number of people who catch it in those pandemic areas are family members who are handling the secretions from the patient while they're sick, caregivers such as laboratory workers and physicians and nurses, and then the family members as well. So it passes person to person on hands and secretions. So travelers to Africa should avoid Ebola pandemic areas, but in general, those are not the areas where travelers would be going anyway. And one should always wash one's hands when you're traveling often and avoid secretions from other people, even including sexual transmission. Don't have sex with Africans during an Ebola outbreak.
Good advice from an expert there. I'll keep that in mind. Estimates are that over 4 million internally displaced people are right now inside Congo who have been fleeing the violence there. And last year, more than 1.7 million refugees, which puts the scale of this disaster on par with Syria or Yemen. But the rapidly growing number of Ebola cases being reported there only makes things that much worse. The Trump administration announced January 2nd that it was sending a contingent of 80 U.S. troops to neighboring Gabon to serve as a quick reaction force to evacuate people from the U.S. Embassy in Kinshasa, Congo, if the violence begins to threaten U.S. citizens there. The Centers for Disease Control have been interfacing with the U.S. military to be ready to respond to these kinds of disasters rapidly and efficiently. Captain Joel Montgomery is part of the U.S. Public Health Service, which most people don't even know is a uniformed service of the U.S. federal government, although not military.
Diseases respect no borders. So we really need to work a whole of government approach, if you will, to combat disease. Obviously, DoD's main focus is for self-protection, but a lot of what DoD is doing and what the ministries of defense are doing is also public health. It's really all about relationships and about these informal networks that are really going to help us to detect and respond to outbreaks in a rapid fashion. And that's good for the entire world, not just these countries, these specific countries we're working in, but for the global community.
The situation in the DRC is a serious crisis. People are dying and lots more are likely to die. And that's even if Ebola doesn't spread across Africa and around the world. Praying for those people would be a really great idea. And if I can work it out to get over there sometime in the next couple of months, I will. Well, that's all we have for this special edition of the Hot Zone. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm trying to bring you quality news in a whole new way. And today's interview proves we can deliver. So I hope you'll go to patreon.com/hotzone and subscribe for as little as $3 a month. And I'll take those funds with me around the world and let you help people directly in their hour of need. So thanks for being part of helping me not just make the news, but make the news good. I'm Chuck Holton, and this is the Hot Zone.